marketing can't overcome negative product market fit.
If it doesn't work within the first X weeks or months, the likelihood that it'll suddenly work next year is not going to happen.
The most effective CMOs that I've worked with have just as much influence with product as they do with finance.
Where the data tells a story that's gotta be told. It's the art and the science, getting the numbers right.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Brandformance. Today we have Patrick Moran. Patrick is an incredible marketing leader. He's spent time at companies like Netflix and Spotify and eBay and Yik Yak, and most recently at Robinhood, running all of their marketing. Patrick's done it all: performance marketing, brand advertising, incrementality, marketing mix modeling, attribution. So we talk about a pretty broad set of topics in this interview. So let's dive in. Patrick, this is a Saturday. It's Jan 24th. I hope this podcast will come out soon. But thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's going to be fantastic. I want to start right away with Saturday. How did you choose Saturday as the day that you wanted to record this? Tell me about that.
Wow. Well, I mean, I guess it's probably the most relaxed day that I have, right? So I usually run
All
on
right.
mornings, and then I don't really think about much outside of where to take my son for the day. I hope
Are
that
your weekends sacred? Like, do you try to keep your weekends sacred for, family time, or is it you're always thinking about work and you're always thinking about marketing? I'm curious.
I don't know that I'm always thinking about marketing, but I guess depending on the situation, I kind of am always thinking about work to some degree. And I guess maybe the degree by which I think about work during the weekends is the least normally than maybe during the week. So hopefully the answers that I provide you with are a little bit more higher quality. And
All right, we'll circle back to this concept because I'll bring it back later in the conversation. But I always like to start with a discussion and a question for our guests. What is a brand that you are actually jealous of at the moment, and why? It's always interesting for me to ask that question of
yeah,
operators and practitioners. But I'm curious, what do you think?
I don't know. It's a little bit of a hard question to answer. So maybe I'm gonna maybe try and answer a different question. Um,
Sure.
I mean, if I had to answer that question right now, I'd probably think of, some brands that I really am, sort of passionate about, like Patagonia or Spotify, despite the fact that I work there. But a lot of these brands that I do like are brands that have been able to sort of take a stand and get a rabid following of people who are just ultra passionate about what they do, right? And so I've been fortunate to be a part of some of those brands, but some of those other brands, I mean, I can name a few of them, right? Like Patagonia is probably one of them, Airbnbs and other. But I guess maybe to answer a slightly different question, brands that I am jealous of, or at least brands that I know have done well. I mean, I think I just think about Netflix a lot. Uh,
Mm.
about Netflix now and what they're doing and what they're doing in the industry, but I also think about Netflix, after Quickster, right? So after Quickster, they lost what, 70-80% of their market cap. They lost
Oh
about
my God!
5% of their user base. I think,
Wow.
yeah, I think Carl Icahn was vulturing the company, right?
Mm.
Take a poison pill, which is basically a way for them to say, well, we're going to dilute the company so much that you're going to sort of make the sale prohibitive. But then being able to bounce back out of that because of their brand,
Ah.
which I can talk about a little bit more, is probably one thing that I'll always admire because I've seen it from the inside, right?
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of that name in probably a decade, Quickster.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think most people have forgotten that that ever happened, right? This was basically where they had split the physical mailing product from like the streaming product, if I remember correctly.
that's correct.
And and then they brought it back together just under the Netflix brand and just went all in on obviously what Netflix is today. And that's the transition that you're talking about. Okay, and we will definitely get into that because I'm very curious about sort of all of the steps that you've taken in your career. But one thing that I'm particularly curious about. So you worked at some of the best brands, literally in tech, right? So you were at Spotify, you were at Netflix, you were at Yik Yak. I don't know how many people remember that, but it was quite an awesome journey. And also like eBay and some other companies before that. How did you? And then for a while you were doing some consulting work and sort of you were working with Reforge and sort of teaching brand marketing courses, and then you got brought back into sort of an operating role at Robinhood. What was the journey or the process behind that? And tell me about that.
To be completely candid, I mean, I think a large part of it is just the opportunities of a growing industry in the mobile space, and I just happen to be, a part of it, right? I just happen to have had a sufficient level of experiences with some great brands that I've been able to jump from one company to another depending on the level of interest that they've had. But the other thing too is that a lot of these companies I joined, they were sort of at the precipice of rebuilding or building something new. And
Mm,
I think that's sort of been a lot of the constant, at least the constant theme of a lot of these companies that I've joined is that they're in the process of building something new, right? So at Netflix, again, like they had just come from Quickster and they were building a new marketing organization to tackle originals. At Spotify, it was they were about to go public and start to get into podcast originals as well.
mm,
Right. And I mean, we've seen the significant transformation of Robinhood over the last few years and the company taking sort of, a fairly decent amount of advantage of kind of like this macro environment. Right. So I've just been lucky that, I happen to be in, I guess, maybe the eye of the hurricane, so to speak, and be a beneficiary of a lot of these situations and these companies.
Is there something specific about that, about a transformation, about sort of a new team that particularly sort of attracts you? Like, is that the place where you find yourself being most effective? Is there some reason behind that? Like, tell me about that.
A lot of the people that I think I worked with, who I've kept in touch with, including founders, have all been builders. And I
Mm,
think there's a little bit of a difference between being a builder and being someone who can come in and just taking something that already exists and then optimizing against it, right? I mean, there's obviously overlap, but you know, I think that's probably what attracts me to a lot of these situations is that there's something to build. There's something that whether it's something new, and oh, you know what, I have some experience in that, and I'm going to apply something to that, or something that I've never seen before, right? So getting into Robinhood, I'd never been in fintech
mm.
before, so I think there's a lot of that as well. It's just that sort of mentality that you're about to embark on building something roughly from the ground up and then scale it, right? So and there have been times that I've succeeded and there have been times that I've failed, right? So it's also one of those things where it's not necessarily always a positive, and I guess that's what makes the adventure worth taking, right? It's just there's a lot of risk involved, and you don't know what the macro environment's going to look like. You don't know what people you're going to be working with, et cetera, et cetera. So
Okay. Well, I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot, but since you brought it up, right? Not everything is going to succeed. So let's talk about sort of maybe an example, whether it was, a particular time at one of these companies or something else where you've had to kind of experience failure in the marketing or the growth space. Would you be comfortable talking about something like that?
sure, yeah, I'm just trying to remember, like, I think in every
Yeah.
company there's been some kind of failure, some kind of learning, right? So, but sure, yeah, let's get into it.
Pick one, like maybe from Robinhood or from a different time. Like let's pick one and let's talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Let me think about this for a second.
All
Okay,
good? Yeah.
so let's go with Yik Yak. How about that? Right? Let's go. Let's go.
Yep.
Let's go with Yik Yak. The interesting thing with Yik Yak is that the brand was so strong, right?
Right.
Meaning, and one of the areas or one of the criteria for determining that is one, obviously product market fit, right? So what are your retention rates looking like? Are people coming in and are they staying for the most part? It's a function of volume and retention. So that's one part. The other part of it is, well, how does it compare to other competitors, right? And
Hmm.
so with Yik Yak, I mean, I think we had both, right? So we had volume and we had retention rates that were fairly strong, and at the same time, there were a lot of competitors who were trying to copy the platform and yet could not necessarily get the escape velocity that Yik Yak had gotten. And I think that was fairly successful. But the challenge was that we basically hit the ceiling of our TAM, which is 4-year college students. In the US, I don't know I think that's somewhere around 5 to 10 million, right? It's not a lot.
Mm,
And not only that, but we were mostly popular with freshmen and sophomores. By the time that students got to become juniors and seniors, they didn't need a social media app to give them company, right? At that point, they
Mm.
already made friends. And I think, as a team, one of the things that we were trying to figure out is, well, how do we find the next sort of escape velocity, right? Like, how do we determine the next phase of growth? And one of the things that we did was we went counter to what made us popular in the first place, which was anonymity, right? Like the users were anonymous and everything, and we had to force situations where users had to provide a username.
Mm.
And the thing is, like, we had tested this. We tested it in Australia, and it actually didn't test fairly well. But
Mm.
we were like, you know what? We'll overcome it with other product features and capabilities. That we were going to sort of that we were going to provide. And yeah, I mean, the interesting thing with a lot of these companies, especially in tech, is the speed of acceleration going up. It's like the amount of time it took Yik Yak to get to 5 million MAU was pretty quick. It was faster than a lot of other companies at that point in time.
Right.
But it also works the other way. So, so the speed by which that network effect also goes negative was pretty fast, and we
Mm.
experienced that, within the first few months of launching this new feature.
Mm.
And, that's a little bit more of a company level sort of situation, but from a marketing standpoint, I mean, we did as much as we could, right? We worked with community, we changed a lot of our narrative. We
Mm.
got our founders to go talk to our users. We did as much as we possibly could. And the thing is, marketing can't overcome negative product market fit, right? That's just a fact of
Not gonna
life.
happen.
Right?
Yep.
If anything, marketing the way that we define it today, which is mostly sort of focused on distribution, mostly amplifies what already exists, right? And
Mm.
so I think that ended up forcing the sale of the company and liquidating a lot of the assets, and everybody had to leave. But I think as I look back into a lot of some of the challenges and failures, I guess that I had been a part of, I think that probably one that stepped in.
Can I ask you a question? That brings up a very very interesting point, right? You said the way we define marketing today is very focused on distribution and promotion. I completely agree with you, right? Any tech company that you go and talk to, in fact, even like a CPG company, marketing has been kind of siloed to this promotion part of the business. Do you think that is warranted? Do you think that is the right way? Do you think that that is the just, how things are going to be? Or do you see a world where marketing plays a bigger role in pricing and product and packaging and all of the other four Ps than just a promotion? What's your take?
Well, I guess the 4 Ps that you talk about, that was defined in, like, 1962, right? So meaning
Mhm.
it was in the world of marketing, or specifically brand management, back in the early in the late si in the early '60s, right? And so do I see it coming back to that? Well, no, I think it's gonna continue to evolve, right? And so, you think about, and so let me dive a little bit more into the Netflix example, then come back to what you talk about,
Yeah.
right? And so I get a lot of questions around, okay, well, what did Netflix do to overcome kind of like the Quickster situation? Did you
Mm.
change your narrative? Did you change your positioning? Did you change your audience makeup, et cetera, et cetera? And I was like, and I look back and I'm like, well, actually, here are the things that have changed, right? So number one, the level of content changed, right? So
Mm.
so so you went, I mean, Lilyhammer, House of Cards, Arrested Development, Hemlock. I mean, one is the volume of new content, but the quality of new content that just kept coming out into the market was pretty significant, in such a way where now people had so much more to talk about, right? They
Mm.
were lingering about, what happened with Quickster. It was like, oh, new content, oh, new content, new content, right? So that played a massive role. The other thing is, I think what a lot of people forget with what happened to the product. So I think Netflix developed a CDN back then, which increased the streaming quality. So, like, local
Mm.
ISPs could actually, if I remember correctly, like, local ISPs could actually host Netflix content, so that would reduce the amount of lag time for users, right? Which is pretty significant if you think about the international expansion and
Right.
the audience expansion into streaming back then, right? It was 15 years ago now, well 13 years ago, or 14 years ago at this point. And then then they changed the UI, and so that was mostly on the product side. And then on the marketing side, the thing was, okay, well, how do we look the part? right? So how do we change? And I think if you look at a lot of the ads that we had back in 2011, 2012, it was a lot of more informational ads, right? It was more like stream anywhere, cancel anytime.
Mm,
It was very folksy. There were, I think, like squirrels, like talking
I
about
remember.
what Netflix was, et cetera, et cetera. Two, suddenly it's like, okay, well, look, this is now a premium brand that is similar to HBO, right? And if you think
Mm,
about all of those factors and, and even some of the changes in the pricing, that fundamentally changed the brand, right? Like that
mm,
fundamentally changed like the trajectory of the brand. And that wasn't just marketing. It was the entire organization, right? And so I think going back to your question about do I think it would, marketing would come back to sort of the four Ps. And really, I mean, it depends on what we define marketing to be, but today that's really mostly the work of a general manager, right?
right.
Which if you think about is sort of the same role that brand managers had historically in CPG, right? They're basically the P&L owners, and not they own price, promotion,
Yep. Yep.
um, you know, and they
Placement
also
and yep.
yeah, well, the placement for distribution, and then they also owned R&D, right?
Yep.
And that, today it's a little bit of a different world where, the product folks own R&D, right? I mean, it's just that because they have the direct relationship with the engineer. So, do I think that specifically in software and in tech that it's ever going to go back to that? I don't think so. I think it's eventually going to continue to evolve. But what most situations have evolved into is that marketing has now been equated to distribution. All right.
Right.
It's paid media, it's life cycle marketing, it's promotions to some degree, but it is distribution, right? It's anything that is off the product experience to some degree is marketing, and then everything else is product. And so
How do you personally sort of think about that? So when you take a new role or, you join a new team, do you primarily focus on distribution then as a marketing leader, as a growth marketing leader? Obviously that's like what you get, what you've done a lot of it. Or do you feel like you still have to influence those other pieces even if you're not directly accountable and responsible for product for example?
the best CMOs I think that I've worked with, and I think the most effective CMOs that I've worked with have just as much influence with product as they do with finance.
Mm,
So yes, I mean I think insofar as very strong marketers, I think very strong marketers understand that all of these things require some level of cohesion. And in order to lap competitors, you need to develop fundamentally new initiatives and capabilities because you don't want to get into a situation where you're in a bidding war for Google UAC, right? Like you don't want to get into a bidding war on Meta, and then suddenly that's the only area of competition that you can compete with your competitors, right? It just becomes sort of a race to zero at that point. So yeah, so I think great marketers sort of really understand that. Now, specifically for me, a lot of the questions I typically get are about unit economics, and if you break down unit economics, I mean it is basically the language that translates to other areas is just much more numeric, right? So unit economics basically comes down to, I would say, maybe three factors, right? So first factor is CAC, second factor is LTV or ARPU, and the third factor is incrementality. Now, I can't affect all of them in the same degree, right? I can affect some of them to some degree and some of them indirectly. But I think folks who can really speak to that and fundamentally understand how each of those areas move, I think obviously have an effect or implications to the product roadmap, go to market events, seasonality, and things like that.
you said something really powerful here, right? And the thing that you said, and I tell, everybody in this space to think like exactly what you just laid out, which is if you understand your CAC, your LTV, ARPU, and your incrementality, by understanding those metrics and the behaviors of those metrics over time, you have a unique position to be able to influence the drivers of LTV, the drivers of CAC, the drivers of incrementality, which may exist in different parts of the organization, but it's rare to find leaders who understand all three of those things, right? Because of just like how modern organizations have been set up in the org design. And if you can, as a CMO, as a head of marketing, become the person who understands that P&L really really well, you suddenly have a secret, superpower that nobody else, I think, at the C-suite has.
Yeah, and that's why it requires a very strong relationship with the CFO or with finance, right? Because I think the fundamental understanding that finance has is should roughly be the same as the CMO or the marketing organization, but the way to execute and impact those numbers is different. But at least the fundamental understanding is there, right? But yes, I mean to your point, I get a ton of questions, or I've gotten a ton of questions across many of my roles, which is okay, well, how do we market this particular product more than this other product? Or how do we
Mm.
focus on this versus, more on that, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to do that, I mean, yes, I mean, you have to understand CAC, but you have to understand how ARPU is developed, right? Like,
Mhm.
okay, what are the subcomponents of ARPU? What are the conversion rates that users have from one area to another? And then how do you influence that in order for your overall ROI to make sense, right? And so you need to understand that. And I think one that from a numeric standpoint, that's a partnership with the CFO, but from a product standpoint, that's a partnership with the product team, right?
Yep.
So yeah, so I mean, I think
Hey, folks, thanks for listening to this podcast today. If you're enjoying the show and if you're getting value out of it, we'd really appreciate if you drop us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcasting app.
I want to pivot the conversation a little bit to the core thesis of this podcast. We call ourselves Brandformance, and the reason we have that name is because I personally think that this separation between brand and performance can sometimes be problematic and artificial, and might even drive lower performance, in my opinion. But and the reason I say that is I think brand definitely performs, and performance definitely builds brand. What is your take on brand versus performance? Do you ascribe to the same mentality? Do you have a different point of view on how to think about brand and marketing investments versus performance marketing investments? I'm curious how you think about this, given you've spent probably billions of dollars on both brand and performance.
yeah. I've gotten this question everywhere I've gone. So I guess maybe a few things just to sort of start to isolate the problem a little bit more, right? Because I think if people come in with different definitions, then everybody loses from the get go, right? So I guess maybe what I'll say first is there is a difference between brand marketing and brand advertising, right? And so I
Mm.
think from that standpoint, there is usually this sort of situation where some other leader or what have you will reach out and they're like, well, we need to drive the brand because this other company is driving the brand. And in their head, they've already sort of decided that driving the brand means to go buy linear TV and go spend what 15-20% of your media on production to develop like an amazing, creative asset, right? And
Mm.
automatically that's brand marketing, right? Where we just previously just talked about the fact that there are a significant amount of other variables and factors that impact the brand. And really, brand marketing is not just a job of the marketing team, it's probably just as much the job of the product team as well, right? So I'll put aside brand marketing for a second and stick to maybe brand advertising. And so when we say brand advertising, I think really more often than not, what people mean when they say brand advertising is to optimize for reach first before
Mm.
optimizing for conversions, right? So your look back period within, whatever your programmatic channels or whatever other channels is whatever it is, right? 6, 7 days,
Sure.
30
Yep.
days, whatever it is. And then, if you run enough tests, you run enough incrementality tests, you can better determine the impact of your spend against those conversions, right? Within a certain amount of time. But obviously, what people sort of also understand, or what most people understand, is that a lot of the channels that typically drive the incremental lift from a conversion standpoint are a lot of these programmatic channels, which are mostly derived from users or signal that these platforms get about a user or a volume of users who are somewhat interested in your product, right? So Google or Facebook will basically be able to get all of this signal from their family of properties, and then from their hundreds of variables at whatever given point in time, they're able to get your ad in front of those users to drive more conversion, right? So that you give them more money over the course of time, right? They become like
Yep.
heroin, basically, right? So but then the other understanding is that, well, you're only then converting people who have indicated some level of interest. What about all of those
Mm.
other people who, have not indicated that level of interest, right? Number one. Number two, how do you tell quote unquote a story to all of these other people, right, who may or may not have indicated interest that you can't tell in a paid search ad or, a 5-second ad on TikTok or a 5-second ad on Meta or whatever, right? And so really what they're saying is, well, you got to optimize for reach so that eventually you increase your TAM for Google and for your other sort of programmatic channels to basically be able to collect against over the course of time, right? Which is basically the definition of demand collection and demand generation. So if we look at the world that way, then yes, I
Mm,
agree with you, right? That this is both a brand and a performance play. All right. So one, yes, I mean you do have to tell a story in some way, shape, or form, right? But the thing is, like, I wouldn't necessarily limit it to just linear TV, but you do have to tell a
yeah,
story in some way, shape, or form to increase your reach so that you push up your marginal ROI on your programmatic channels and be able to sustain that, right? But I think mathematically, that's the better way that I kind of like think about it is that you have a fundamental understanding of your diminishing returns for all your channels. And then how do you push them up? By basically sort of increasing your reach, which doesn't necessarily mean that you need to spend a whole bunch on linear TV. It could also mean an influencer play. It could mean
right.
events, it could mean conferences, or it could also mean digital channels, but not necessarily just TV, right? So I think that's where I think.
I like that explanation quite a lot, and essentially what you're talking about is, some I believe the Ernberg Bass Institute came up with the 95-5, which was this idea that, hey, a certain part of your audience is in market, have expressed interest or intent, and there's a huge part of the market that is unaware of you, or maybe has not is not in market right now, specifically for the thing that you do. And so that reach focused campaign, or set of campaigns or set of activities is trying to get those 95% when they do enter the market to think of you. Now, the challenge that I find on this, Patrick, is that many brands, when they start to think about this reach focused, you know, brand advertising, they try it, they maybe don't get it right on the first go, and they get discouraged, right? You make the first sort of big brand advertising buy, it doesn't have the effect that you think you wanted. Have you experienced that? Have you come across that? How do you navigate that in a modern organization where the CFO is breathing down your neck a little bit and the CEO is breathing down your neck a little bit in terms of, everything needs to have some ROI and a sort of direct way of thinking about the impact that you're having on the P&L. What's your take on how to approach that, and maybe just general guidance on how long do you wait before you truly give up versus, how much iteration is required to get it right?
So I take a little bit of a different view on this one. And ultimately the view that I take on this one is, and let's stick to paid media, right? Like let's put
Sure.
aside everything else. So let's put aside anything diminishing returns on lifecycle marketing based off
Yep.
of impressions and what have you. And let's just stick with just paid media and paid media advertising specifically. Within paid media advertising, the way that I like to think about it is less so about brand and performance and more so about channel optimization, right? So every channel to some degree has some kind of like marginal return, right? It's not that different from a portfolio, right? So every
Hmm.
channel has some marginal return. Now, there's an argument to be made that, one channel plus another channel would drive a higher marginal return than each of these individual channels done independently, right? Which is completely fair. All right, that's what the MMM is for. But more often than not, if you're able to somehow derive the marginal returns of each channel,
Mm,
from that standpoint, then it becomes a question of how do you push them all up? And so there are various ways to push them up, right? One is, okay, well, maybe we should target existing users, right?
mm,
Who are not, engaged with the product. Maybe we should target, some ancillary audience or whatever it is, right? One of them is reach, right? One of them is, okay, well, let's target users who are not members of our product and then, see what happens with those users, right? But that's how I like to think about it is how do you then push marginal returns? Now, I think if you go a little bit deeper, there's always a question around, okay, well, it takes, several months for TV to convert versus Google. right?
Mm.
It takes, some of these other channels longer to convert than some of these other channels, right? And I think sort of my answer to that is, well, then normalize against that using the right look back period, right? So
Mm.
there are some products, so there are some channels where the look back period is 8 weeks, and there's some channels where the look back period is 7 days. But I'm telling you right now, there is no channel where the look back period is 1 year. All right.
Yeah.
Like I don't even remember an ad that I saw, it's like 3 days ago, let alone, a year ago. And really what that comes down to is an impression play, right? And
Yeah.
so there's also the minimum amount of impressions that it takes for the look back period to be as effective as possible in order to measure that. But that's my answer to all of these questions around, okay, well, if we're going to invest in quote unquote brand, we need to invest in these channels, and you can't tell me, or we can't measure that, this year. We would have to measure it next year. I'm just like, you know what? Then if that's if that's the case, then I'll pour my money into promotions. Then, like, well, what do you mean? What do you like? Then
Yeah, yeah,
we
yeah.
go back
Totally
into this,
with you on that same page.
right? Then we
Yeah,
go
yeah,
back
yeah.
to this fallacy about marketing is the only team that can drive the brand, right? You mean all of these
Mm.
other teams can't drive the brand, right? So that's kind of like how I think about it with reach, right? It's less about it's yeah, it's less about the short term
Yeah.
and more about that framework and that structure.
Totally with you. I think the to build on that topic, and I completely agree with you. If it doesn't work within the first X weeks or X months, the likelihood that it'll suddenly work next year is just, you know, frankly not going to happen. But I also noticed that certain organizations just don't have that muscle built out. Right. So I'll take an example. They do YouTube advertising for the first time, or they do CTV or TV advertising for the first time. And they get a negative result. They're like, "Hey, there's no incrementality in this particular test that we ran for like 8 weeks or 12 weeks." And what I encourage teams to do is like, "Hey, don't give up on the channel just because you had a negative result on this incrementality test. Let's really dig into, was it the creative? Was it the targeting? Was it the storytelling? Like, what was it about this campaign that didn't work? And let's go back and test again if you have a strong hypothesis for why you should exist on this channel." Do you agree with my take, or do you feel like that you can cut your losses and just, if you don't see incrementality in your first couple of tests, kind of start operating in a different way?
Kind of. So I guess in every organization I've been a part of that have been able to effectively scale to more than 2 to 3 channels, there's always been that one flagship, right? There's always been that one that has worked by far and has hit, escape velocity way before everybody else, right? And so for some companies, it's TV. For some companies, it's Google. For a lot of companies, it's Google. For a lot of
Yep.
companies, it's Facebook, right? Some companies find, but there is that one. There's always that
Mm,
one that for a period of time is driving 80% or 90% of the spend, right? And then at that point, you're like, okay, well, if we can hit it with this channel, then let's see what we could do with other channels to increase, our reach, right? So I think from that standpoint, then it basically goes into the same question around, okay, well, how do we get to number two? Well, how do we get to number
mm.
three, right? From number one, right? Which is not that different from, I guess, the situation that you're describing, right? Which
Yep.
is, okay, well, how do we sort of supplement the winner channel? And so I guess the reason why I'm saying that is because, well, first of all, you have to find your winner channel, right? You have to
Totally.
find one, right? You have to find your anchor. And if you haven't found your anchor, my suggestion is actually slightly counterintuitive, which is don't try to test 10 channels, make one work. Just make one work,
100%.
right?
Yep.
And so the discipline of making one work, to your point, basically means that you have to uncover all of these situations, right? The macro environment, the bidding capability, audience targeting, creative, your product. Are they driving higher ARPU than organic? Can you incrementality test? Blah, 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 et cetera, right? So that's kind of like how I think about it. Now, insofar as like early signals, usually we'll look at, or usually like I'll look at attribution. Like it
Hmm.
costs money to run incrementality tests, right? And it costs a lot of time. So just figure out, I mean, I think for me, just figure out whether or not you're getting traction from an attribution standpoint and whether or not this is kind of like working. And then from there, to iterate, right? Okay, well, is it the right creative? Well, for our anger channel, these are the right creatives. So at least you have some baseline to use to sort of, bring it to the second channel, right? So usually I think, or what I find is that obviously getting your first anchor channel is usually the most challenging, and I think the second most challenging is finding the second one. But I think it becomes less and less challenging after you've found the second one. Because more
Mm.
often than not, your first one is Google and your second one's Facebook. So, so
Yeah.
especially tech, right? I mean, they have the best. I mean, yeah, they have the world's best AI
Yeah.
or ML engineers
Yep.
sitting on top of stacks that have been developed over the last 10 or 20 years, right? That have been able to sort of gather as much. So usually if you're able to make Google and Facebook work, it's a little bit easier to find some of the other channels that'll work. I think TV is probably a good third one, more so than some of the other channels, just because of the reach and the volume that TV is
Yep.
able to provide. The only thing is it's just so decoupled and
Right.
decentralized. You can go programmatic, you go linear, and even within
It's also
linear.
different, right? Like creating a good TV ad is a very different skill set from a creative and messaging and storytelling perspective compared to a, 5-second reel on Meta or a search ad on Google. So there's also a skill question of does your team or do you have the right agency partners to support you in that type of, media buying? Okay, we have to talk about this because, obviously, as we all know, Google and OpenAI have launched new inventory and it's all sort of I won't bias you. What is your take on what's going to happen with ads in ChatGPT and ads in Google AI overviews and what have you? Do you think that they're going to behave similarly to what search ads are, or do you think there's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what ads are going to look like in these AI environments?
Well, the short answer is I don't know because I only have a vantage point or a viewpoint on what I'm familiar with, right? And a lot of these things eventually evolve, over the course of time, right? Like if you think about when Facebook started launching their ads, at the beginning, it was really bad. Like I remember, Alex, and I think they were trying to copy Google to some degree, but it was
Right.
just weird, right? So based on like you buy ads based off of likes and page post likes, and it was just weird. But they were figuring it out, right? And I think it's the same thing here. And I think, I mean, Google is the same way, right? Like for the longest time before I think they acquired Overture or GoTo for paid search. They were using, I think they were mostly free, if not all doing banner advertising, right? So
Yeah.
like any of these things that you don't know, right? They'll probably start with something that advertisers are familiar with, right?
Hmm.
Which is probably an auction situation on programmatic buying. And then they'll probably, mix that in with direct buys to guarantee a certain level of inventory. But at some point, if they're a true sort of technology play, they're going to automate a lot of these things so that, advertise can kind of like self automate. But I think, I think that that's probably what's going to happen. Now you get into kind of like the situation, which is sort of what Andrew Chen was talking about many years ago, which is I think he's saying the laws of shitty clicks, right? Or so like shitty click where, the earlier ones that get in are the ones that generate a ton of alpha, but, the more crowded the advertising space gets, the more you get crowded out. Now, I think there's kind of like a different dimension to that, which is also supply, right? So the number of advertisers coming in cannot
Mm.
outpace the amount of supply that, the platform is able to generate, because then that's where you start to get crappy click-throughs, right? And so I think from that standpoint, I think OpenAI is, I don't know what their MAU is, but it's pretty significant. So it probably take a while
I think it's
for
like 800 million if I'm not
yeah,
wrong.
for
Yeah, something.
demand to equate to supply. The other thing too is like I don't like depends on so many capabilities. Are Can they get the targeting right? Can they get the bidding in the auction system right? Et cetera, before the real money starts to come in. I think you'll probably see some test money come in there,
Mm.
and maybe for a few years you'll get like test budgets in there. But you want Google budget, right? I mean, that's what you want.
Yeah.
Well,
Yep.
I mean, I guess it also depends on their main revenue, their main sort of revenue driver, right? I mean, if their main revenue driver is B2B and subscriptions, then maybe advertising kind of like Netflix is more supplementary versus Google, where their
Mm.
main revenue driver is ads, right? So, but yeah, I mean, I guess it'll depend on how quickly they can go from test budget to main budget over the course.
Let's talk about your own AI usage, right? So as a consumer, as in, in your personal life or in your work life, do you find yourself using AI more and more for, daily things, or do you feel like it has plateaued after the last 3 years? Like, and do you have any predictions about sort of a consumer standpoint, given that you've seen so many consumer companies? What is the next 3 or 4 years of AI usage going to look like? Like, like, are you finding ourselves like that we've tapped out and there's really that not that much more that's going to happen? Or, and I know I'm asking you a completely unreasonable question, but I'm just curious what your take is.
I mean, it's definitely not tapped out
Mm,
because use cases are just generating even newer use cases, right? And so obviously the most common one is search to prompting and then, essentially developing these bots to automate and automatically develop new things, right? How is it going to impact consumer products? I have no idea. I don't I have no I don't I don't know. I mean, right now, for I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. Spotify just launched what you call prompted playlists, and prompted playlists is essentially an AI playlist where you develop a playlist, but it automatically refreshes itself,
oh, that's
right?
amazing.
And that's just a small, just sort of a one-off. Yeah, but I use it all the time now, right? And then
Wait,
I
how
was
come I haven't seen this in my Spotify app? Do you think it's just a beta or something? Or?
Mm, I'm I think, so I used to joke about this even when I was at Spotify, but I'm not a daily active user. I'm an
Got it.
hourly active user. Like, I'm s I'm like I'm like a power user. Audio is just a big thing for me. Audio from podcasts
Mm,
to music to audiobooks, it's a big thing for me. But anyway, so that's one small use case, right? And it's evolved, right? They had DJ AI, and
yep.
then you do a whole bunch of things. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that's on Robinhood right now with Cortex and the stuff that product is doing. At some point, with financial applications, I would assume that investments are going to be a little bit more driven by some level.
Mm,
I mean, I don't know, and the reason why I say I don't know is because I mean we had been using machine learning for the longest time even before ChatGPT came on board, right? I mean, so machine
yep.
learning has already been here. So I guess maybe the only thing I'll say is at some point, it, it will become pretty evident that my daily use of AI is so ubiquitous that I wouldn't even know that it's AI or not, right? So that's as much as I promise. But yeah, I have no idea what what the future holds from that
I
standpoint.
if we could predict the future, we'd all be sipping pina coladas on the beach. So well said. Okay, couple questions before we try to close this out. So I noticed that you have a mix of so you did your MBA, but before that, you do an information sciences or a computer sciences degree, or what was your education all about?
So I moved to the States from the Philippines, and I had a communications degree from a university in the Philippines. And after the dot-com bubble bursting, I realized that background or that educational background wasn't going to get me jobs. um,
Mm,
so, so I took a couple of courses, or I took a program in Colombia around, yeah, like information sciences and what have you. I'm not saying that necessarily landed me my job, but I could at least speak somewhat intelligently about, you know, information sciences back then. So that's a story
And
behind.
you also had a stint building infrastructure for hedge fund companies? Is that right? Like that
Yeah,
was it threw me for a loop. Like, so tell me more about that. Like, what was the reason behind that adventure before going back to sort of the marketing side of the house?
what was the reason behind? Well, the number one reason for that was it allowed me to continue to pay rent in Manhattan. I mean, that's
Okay.
reason. But no, but I actually ended up, it was I think I stayed there for about a good 4 or 5 years and really built out. some pretty solid relationships with a lot of the folks there. But I don't know. I mean, I think it was actually candidly, it was actually less about the job. The job was fine. It was we were building out infrastructure, technology infrastructure for hedge funds. And if you think about hedge funds, they have a lot of money. Their shops are fairly small,
Mm,
but they require very, very little downtime, right? So there's a very specific niche on how to do that effectively and at scale, right? So it's not like we're building for 300,000, 5,000 person shops. We were building for 20, 25, you know, 30 people shops with 2 or 3 billion under management, back then, right? So it's a little bit different. The thing that I really particularly enjoyed about it was actually more the camaraderie that we had built out as a team because we had to do this at scale, working with hedge funds folks back then and well now I haven't worked with hedge funds in a while was not easy. um,
yeah.
well, a different personality. But the thing is, like, our reputation was so good in the quality of the work that we provided that the amount of clients that we would get was it was almost it almost never stopped. So I
Mm.
think that sort of mentality of being able to move fast, building things, scaling, I think was what sort of appealed to me back.
It also feels like what I've noticed these days is a lot of sort of modern tech organizations, the CMO role or the head of marketing role or the head of growth marketing role, like these roles, I'm seeing more and more technical people in those roles, or at least like they've done some technical work in their life and are able to then sort of translate a lot of the systems thinking, engineering thinking, the information science thinking to the marketing world and are very sort of, comfortable with talking about machine learning and AI and this and that. Do you agree with me, or do you feel like my point of view is biased here?
I think maybe to some degree, there is that because again, to go back to how do you influence ARPU or even how do you influence CAC, you need to have a fundamental understanding of conversion rates, or what drives conversion rates, what drives retention rates, and sort of user flows and things like that, which is very much more product and engineering driven. And even
Mm,
within the CAC standpoint, right? Like you just have to understand how do you integrate your MMP, how do you, use the tools that you have today to some degree. But again, like I think there is that component, but um it doesn't necessarily overcome the other components of just having a fundamental understanding of growth, right? So that's why you still see a lot of very strong folks who come from CPG who manage a P&L. You see a lot of strong folks who come from data science. You see a lot of folks coming from product, and then you also see a lot of folks coming from finance, right?
mm.
But I think that's probably why is okay. Well, can you effectively manage a P&L and figure out, what are the areas to drive growth and then go from there. So
Great way to bring it to a close. I have one last question for you, and we ask every guest this question, so it'll be fun. If you could run absolutely any marketing experiment that you wanted to, no budget constraints, no compliance constraints, what would it be and why?
I actually did a little bit of this at Netflix because of international, but if it were up to me and I were able to run anything for the sake of learning, I would have a perpetual and persistent holdout somewhere,
All right.
which is practically impossible, right? Because I
Yep.
mean, if you have an event, right, or if you have organic social, or you got some of these things, like you can't isolate some of that, right? But I would have some kind of like persistent and perpetual holdout going on. And the only way I think that a lot of companies do it now is mostly through international. It's by market and comparing one country
Right.
to another country. But
Yeah, that's a good one.
yeah, yeah.
That's a good
That's
one. That's a
that's
good one. Awesome, Patrick. Well, thank you for making the time today. This was fantastic. I think our audience will learn a lot. And I know you are in between things, so I'm very excited about sort of where you're going to be in the next couple of months. And we'll catch up in a few months again. Maybe have you on the podcast and talk about when you're ready to announce the big news.
that sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully this was helpful.
It was fantastic. All right, folks, that was Patrick Moran from Robinhood. He's a great follow. He's not as prolific on LinkedIn as he used to be, but I would give him a follow And I'm sure he is going to be hiring a great number of people over the next few months in his new gig, which he hasn't announced yet. So go follow him on LinkedIn and tune in again next week for another great episode of Brand Formance. Thank you.